Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab, and we would continue with our answer writing practice on GS papers of Civil Service Main Examination. We would discuss a question that you might encounter in GS paper 3 of the main examination. So let us read out the question together. What impacts will the global climate change have on biodiversity? Discuss. So this is a straightforward one, a very straight question where you do not have to use your interpretation of the question. So how do you introduce how do you attempt these type of answers? Actually, in these type of answers there is in ample scope and in fact opportunity to include as many examples as the time constraint of the examination permits you. So you include as many examples as you can. We would be introducing our answer taking a very you could say compassionate stand for our fellow denizens, the denizens of this planet Earth. So we would take this position that human action is harming not only the humans but also other animals, that is the biodiversity too. Let us begin. It's a poetic irony that man's unbridled greed has come to haunt him in the form of a specter of climate change. You could skip this part, giving the time constraint, but what we are trying to do here, that we are taking this stand that the climate change is actually the handiwork of humans, and unfortunately this human work, this human handiwork is coming back to, you could say, harm and in fact haunt not only humans but also the entire biodiversity. Climate change threatens not only the weather phenomena and coastal communities but the entire biosphere itself. And the impacts climate change will have on biodiversity will be unlike anything observed before. We are making this a statement, and it certainly stands. Now, we would discuss some technical terms here. As traditionally understood, actually it is a convention to talk of three components or three dimensions, actually not components, three dimensions of biodiversity, all of which are endangered by climate change. So what are these three dimensions of biodiversity? These are species biodiversity, the, you could say, the high number of species a particular ecosystem has. Genetic diversity is also there. Genetic diversity means the individuals are genetically, you could say, not related to each other, because if they are related it would lead to problems like inbreeding. We are not going to discuss these things in deep, but genetic diversity is another dimension of biodiversity. And the third one is habitat diversity. Actually there are many habitats in a particular ecosystem, and all of this diversity of habitat constitutes the habitat biodiversity. Now, the ill effects of climate change on biodiversity would be observed on many aspects, which, as you can see, the adjoining graphic introduces some of these aspects. First one would be habitat loss and degradation. You can well understand that due to climate change, there would be habitat loss as well as degradation of habitats. That is ultimately some of the functions which are performed by habitat, some of the qualitative aspects of the habitat would be adversely affected. Then come microclimate change. What microclimate change means? You could well understand that some of the places, for an example, mountain tops or peak of mountains, or for that matter, one particular pool would have its own, you could say, microclimate. It would be different from the surrounding area. So ultimately, climate change is going to wipe off these microclimates. Till now, these micro ecosystems harbor very unique biodiversity. They would have some endemic species and so many other things, and ultimately As we would see through examples, climate change would harm microclimate also. Then obviously, this is very obvious, heat stress. You could give the examples of coral reefs and so many other things. Then come some invasive species. What actually happens as the colder climate, for an example, on high mountains or in the Arctic or the Antarctic, till now it prevents it prevents some of the invasive species from expanding their range to the colder areas. But as the colder areas warm up, the invasive species would ultimately they would invade these areas too. Then there are some emerging infectious diseases, for an example the H5N1 or the bird flu virus. What is actually feared? Experts fear that climate change would ultimately lead to not only emergence of some of the new pathogens, for an example many form of influenza, that is flu viruses, but ultimately they would have a far wider range. They would start affecting some of the areas which were not previously affected by these viruses. Then obviously some severe weather events would turn into calamities like floods, droughts, etc., which you ultimately know that these harm biodiversity in many ways. Now let us talk of these things in detail. Actually, a few years back, you could say some naturalist from National Geographic had captured a poignant picture, a heart-wrenching picture of a starving polar bear somewhere in, if I am not wrong, in Canada. So we are talking of this polar bear a few years back had alarmed naturalists. The melting of ice sheets and the warming Arctic Ocean has lost the polar bear its habitat and the hunting ground. As you can well understand that the polar bear hunts on the floating ice, it hunts on the ice sheet, and when the ice itself is being lost, the polar bear is not able to adjust to the suddenly changed, you could say suddenly changed situation, and ultimately it's losing its hunting ground. And in fact some of the experts have feared that the warming Arctic Ocean is leading to harmful algal blooms. You are probably aware about the phenomenon of algal blooms. These are poisonous and in fact toxic alga which ultimately harm the ecosystem, and this would in turn adversely affect the polar bear and other forms of biodiversity too. Moreover, in case of India, some of the experts have feared that seawater intrusion into brackish water ecosystems would harm the mangroves. As you can well understand that mangroves are not threatened only by these, you could say, seawater rise, that the sea level rise, that sea level rise would ultimately submerge the mangroves, and in fact what would happen, the seawater, that is the salt water, would intrude into the brackish water. Brackish water is the you could say the body of water where fresh water and the salt water meets, and ultimately what would happen, the seawater would intrude into the brackish water ecosystem as well as some form of the freshwater ecosystem. In the case of, for an example, the lower reaches of the Ganga Brahmaputra system and most of the eastern coast of India. So ultimately these habitats, these ecosystems would be harmed due to sea level rise, and this would adversely affect their native and endemic biodiversity. Experts fear that microclimate changes like drying up of breeding pools would endanger amphibians in the Western Ghats. This has been in news lately that some of the Western Ghats the Western Ghat ranges have some unique microclimate. You could say, for an example, some of the breeding pools which harbor many which are home to many native amphibians, some of which are yet to be discovered, some of which are yet to be recorded. And ultimately climate change would lead to drying up of these breeding pools, and this would lead to loss of this biodiversity. Now talking of heat stress, we can give the example of coral bleaching events which portend ill for biodiversity rich habitats. Heat stress will affect many life forms adversely. Then warming up climate would attract many invasive species whose invasion is checked only by the cold condition, as we were just talking about. One of the examples which has been observed in Indian Himalayan system, the Himalayan ranges in India, has been the field thistle. Moreover, the warmer climate has been implicated, it has been found to be involved in the evolution of the H5N1 bird flu pathogen. And in fact, it is feared that some new forms of pathogens would emerge due to climate change. Many flu vira would emerge and endanger not only wildlife but humans too. Sometimes what happens that these pathogens would cross the species barrier from the wildlife to humans and ultimately harm humans too. Severe weather events like drought, floods, etc. would increase in frequency. They would have calamitous impact on biodiversity in the long run. You could give some examples here. Now, summing up, climate change would endanger habitats, bring unwholesome changes in weather, trigger calamities, and generate new pathogens. All this would not only harm biodiversity but also humans. Now, we would try to introduce some of the philosophical points here. And one of the concepts is, as you are probably aware, the categorical imperative of compassion towards our fellow beings. Categorical imperative comes down from Kantian. Categorical imperative comes down from Kantian philosophy, from Immanuel Kant's work. Kant's categorical imperative, so the requirement is that we would take a compassionate view towards our fellow beings and try to check the phenomena of climate change as far as possible. It has already taken off and now it would be difficult to check it, but still we must try. And moreover, we were talking about some of the partisanship of the climate talks. As you are probably aware that the climate talks have turned into political, and in fact you could say they have turned into diplomatic slugfests, and this must stop. The time is to take action now because we are already late. So this is how we sum up our answer for today. We reassemble for the next lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.